Okay, I'm going to talk about 10 millimeter. This is a 10 millimeter barrel. This is a 40 Smith & Wesson barrel. It's an aftermarket barrel that's used so that you can shoot 40 in your 10 millimeter. So I'm going to put this aside for now. And what I want to talk to you guys about is the differences of shooting 40 Smith & Wesson in a 10 millimeter barrel on a Glock 20 Gen 4. So as you can see, this is a 10 millimeter barrel. This is polygonal rifling, whereas this one is a more traditional type rifling, a standard type rifling with probably button pulled or something like that. I'm not sure, but the rifling is different in both of these barrels. So anyway, let's start with the 10 millimeter barrel. Notice that when you put the 10 millimeter round in the 10 millimeter barrel, notice that it's flush right here. And it chambers and it stops. So the headspace for this 10 millimeter barrel here was designed for the 10 millimeter cartridge. But now let's try a 40 Smith & Wesson. Okay, notice a 40 Smith & Wesson is going to fit because it's the same diameter. It's just a shorty 10 millimeter. That's all it is. But notice the problem here. It goes in too deep. Another eighth of an inch. So what happens is you can shoot a 40 in a 10 millimeter barrel, but what's going to happen is there's two different things that are different than shooting just a 10 millimeter. The first thing is the extractor, which is my index fingernail, is going to have to hold the cartridge while it's fired. So it's holding it back. The second thing is there's free bore in there, an eighth of an inch free bore. So this bullet here, right where the bullet actually is around the casing here, or in the casing, isn't getting the rifling land and grooves right away. It has to jump forward an eighth of an inch in order to engage the rifling. And most guns, for accuracy and stuff like that, you're going to have a properly seated bullet that is really close to the lands and grooves, rather than a bullet that's set back that has to jump an eighth of an inch in order to engage the lands and the grooves in the rifling. For example, the 10 millimeter here, because it headspaces properly, it's almost touching the lands and grooves right from the start. But the 40 Smith & Wesson, because it's held back, there's an eighth of an inch jump where it has to jump first, then engage the rifling. So there could be differences in accuracy and stuff like that. Now, as far as the extractor, there's some guys that can run these hard, using 40 in a 10 millimeter barrel and not have a problem with that extractor. Because what's happening is the extractor is holding the shell in case so it doesn't go too deep. See that? So what's happening is the striker is striking this, but the extractor is holding the shell right here. And extractor issues, some say they've had it, some say they haven't. But when it comes to Glock and stuff like that, they recommend that you get an aftermarket barrel. And I agree with them. They're really not that more expensive. They're like $100 more for the barrel. But what you get with the barrel is they recommend that if you're shooting hard cast, for instance, whether it's 40 or 10 millimeter in the 10 millimeter barrel, they recommend that you use an aftermarket barrel with conventional rifling instead of polygonal, because polygonal rifling is designed for jacketed bullets. They're not designed for lead hard cast. And sure, you can get away with it. Are you going to get hurt? Well, probably not right away, but the thing is that lead can foul in the barrel, is what Glock is saying. So I'm just going with the company, and I'm going with the experiences that some people have had with it. And I'm sure that the engineers know what they're talking about when it comes to rifled barrels. You have a polygonal barrel and you have a conventional rifled barrel. Polygonal barrels do not do well with lead bullets, whether soft lead or hard cast or whatever. So anyway, that's once again two things. When you're shooting a 40 in a 10 millimeter barrel, the extractor is holding a loose round while the striker has to strike it. So it's holding, the extractor is the only thing that's holding it where it's supposed to be. Otherwise it would fall down. And the other thing is the jump. So the jump free bore that it has to take is 1/8 of an inch, and then it slams into the rifling. That short distance right there, it slams into it, which could affect accuracy. I don't know if it's going to wear out the barrel by jumping like that, but I'm just saying that there's differences here. So the first difference of shooting a 40 in a 10 millimeter barrel is the extractor holds the shell rather than the headspace, rather than it being seated properly. And then the second thing is the bullet has got to jump forward 1/8 of an inch before it engages the rifling. So let's look at a 40 Smith & Wesson barrel. So here you got the extractor having to hold it, which is my fingernail right here. But on a 40 barrel, it headspaces properly. So two things here. Number one is the extractor doesn't have to hold the shell, okay? And it's closer to the rifling engagement. And the other thing is that there's some good accuracy in these barrels too. So it's conventional rifling, but they're still really good barrels. So this barrel solves a couple problems. The first is you don't have to worry about an extractor holding it out where it's supposed to be. And once again, I'm not saying that necessarily your extractor is going to wear out. You know, if you're shooting thousands and thousands of rounds, you know, some guys have had extractor problems. So depending on the kind of, striker spring they have, if you have a light striker spring or a heavy striker spring or whatever, that could probably have an effect on it too. So once again, you're going from this right here, a 40 Smith & Wesson having to be held back by the extractor, having 1/8 of an inch jump until it engages the rifling, which could cause some accuracy problems depending on what kind of rounds you're using, maybe. And like I said, most pistols are designed so that they have proper head spacing. So this 40 Smith & Wesson, just for a little over $100, solves that problem. So now you head space properly, and the extractor doesn't have to hold anything back. So there's no stress on the extractor. I'm not saying there is stress on the extractor, but I'm saying if there was potential stress on the extractor, there isn't, because the fact that the extractor doesn't have to hold it from bottoming out, because it's already bottomed out here. So the reason why I got a 40 Smith & Wesson aftermarket barrel is, number one, it's not that more expensive. Number two, I can shoot hard cast 40 Smith & Wesson in this one. And I don't have to worry about what Glock says about shooting hard cast in here. There might be some truth to it, so I'm going to go with that. I'm going to just get the 40 Smith & Wesson barrel here and be able to shoot hard cast through here, or a standard 40 Smith & Wesson. And same thing with 10 millimeter. If you're going 10 millimeter now for hard cast rather than this one, you'll order a barrel that looks similar to this that you can use to shoot your hard cast. So you're going from polygonal rifling to conventional rifling. You're going from potential buildup too soon in this barrel to not as much buildup in the conventional rifling in this barrel here. So can you shoot 40 Smith & Wesson in a 10 millimeter barrel and not have any problems? Probably. It just depends on a few factors. I mean, you could probably get away with it. You could probably get away with it where the extractor probably doesn't wear out, probably it holds up probably. That 1/8 of an inch jump, maybe the kind of practice you're doing is close distance. You're not doing like longer range shooting or anything like that, just up close and personal defensive shooting. Them 10 yards and in type defense shooting type things, drills that you do. So it just depends on a few things, you know. I mean, you don't really have to worry using this barrel, you know, with 40 Smith & Wesson. I would worry, though, about 40 Smith & Wesson hard cast, if you're shooting hard cast in here, or hard cast 10 millimeter. So if you have hard cast 10 millimeter, I would have a little concern about that, because Glock had mentioned something about buildup in the barrel, or maybe you just clean it out all the time. But the thing is that, you know, they're engineers, they know what they're talking about. So if they say you shouldn't shoot a lot of hard cast in a standard Glock barrel, then you should get an aftermarket barrel in 40 Smith & Wesson and 10 millimeter. And the good thing about the 10 millimeter too, Glock 20 Gen 4 or any kind of 10 millimeter Glock, is that there's barrels, not just a 10 millimeter barrel and a 40 barrel, but 357 SIG is probably a barrel I'm going to get, 357 SIG, so it'll look like this, but it'll be smaller diameter, like a 9 millimeter diameter there. But you got 10 millimeter, 357 SIG, 9x25 Dillon. Once again, you got 10 millimeter, 40 Smith & Wesson, 357 SIG, 9x25 Dillon. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And the other thing you guys have to understand about the 10 millimeter Glock is it's a heavier gun, it's bigger than the Glock 17, larger frame. And the other thing is that when you're shooting, for instance, your 40, and you want lighter recoil, not that the recoil is bad on 10 millimeter, it isn't, even the full power loads. But let's say you wanted something that shoots as soft as 9 millimeter, then you would go with PMC 165 grain, which is about 355 foot-pounds of energy, which is the same as a standard 9 millimeter standard pressure round. The classic 165 grain Hydra-Shock is only 352 foot-pounds in a full-size duty gun. That's 9 millimeter pressure. That's controllable. I mean, a lot of people are saying 40 is snappy, but what are you talking about? Are you talking about 180 grain? Are you talking about the more higher pressure loads, or are you talking about the watered down loads? Because 40 has watered down loads and has higher pressure loads too. So it's a wide range, just like 10 millimeter. With 40 Smith & Wesson, you can start at 350 foot-pounds and go up to almost pretty much within 10 millimeter territory, you know, like 600 foot-pounds or probably even more. So even though the 40 Smith & Wesson, they call it the short and weak, it isn't short and weak because it's more powerful than the 9 millimeter. So even though they call it the 40 Smith and short and weak, the thing you have to understand is just because it's short, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't powder it up really good and get it to its full potential. Because sometimes 10 millimeter like this one is kind of like the FBI load. This is a watered down 180 grain, which is about the same energy as this. It's about 400 some foot-pounds. This is about 425. This is supposed to be about 400 and a 4-inch barrel. So even this by 10 millimeter standards is a watered down 180 grain Federal. So this here, having 400 foot-pounds, it's a pleasure to shoot. It's real soft, but this isn't. This is probably the lowest you can go with 10 millimeters as far as store-bought loads and stuff like that, is about 400 foot-pounds for 10 millimeter. So it makes it for a soft shooting experience. But if you had the 40 Smith & Wesson barrel, now you can drop that down to 350 foot-pounds. So having these two barrels, you have a wide range of energies. And to me, the 10 millimeter cartridge isn't really a hot load until 650 foot-pounds. Then you're talking hot. But anything under that is watered down. 40 Smith & Wesson, 400 foot-pounds to right up to the edge of 600. Okay, 500 foot-pounds is kind of hot. 500 to 600 foot-pounds is kind of hot. But 400 and below that, isn't really hot for a 40. So that's why you get them loads that are 355 foot-pounds like PMC, bronze, 165 grain, or Hydroshock. Now, when I'm talking about Hydroshock, I'm not talking about HST. I'm not talking about Hydroshock Deep or anything like that. I'm talking about the standard old-fashioned 165 grain Hydroshock. Okay, that's the one. That's the one that police duty guns like the Glock 20, or not the Glock 20, but the Glock 22 was using. Some police departments, they were using that. So they didn't have something that was snappy like people thought. I mean, some departments do and some departments don't. But the thing people have to understand about when they say the 40 is snappy, they have to tell you exactly what cartridge are you using. Are you using the watered down 40 or the hot 40? Because every cartridge has a watered down version and a hot version. So 40 Smith & Wesson, when you're talking 400 foot-pounds, of course, it's more powerful than 300 foot-pounds, 325 foot-pounds. So yeah, it's going to have more recoil, but you can manage the recoil by having a stronger grip. So something like this will help you with individual fingers, like this thing I got here. It can help you with individual fingers, including that pinky right there. So you get a very strong grip. And then to have a sustained grip, which is isometrics, to have a sustained grip, like if you're shooting for a long, long time, many, many targets, you want to hold like this and don't let go. And you're going to start shaking, okay? You're going to start shaking. Your wrist is going to shake. And when your wrist starts shaking, when you're shooting, your shots are going to go wild because your muscles and your wrists aren't toned enough so that when you're shooting, your wrist, if your wrist gets tired when you're shooting, for instance, like when you shoot a revolver, like I have a Taurus 605 Poly 357 Magnum, and believe it or not, with your index finger, when you do snap cap practice, your finger is going to get tired, and it is a workout. And you are going to pull the trigger, and you are going to get some shakiness, okay? So that's one of the reasons why you can't neglect your wrists or your finger muscles. You have to make sure that you exercise them and stuff. So it's really important. But yeah, once again, you got let's go over it once again, what I was talking about. You got a 10 millimeter barrel, okay? And what was going on was people were shooting 40 Smith & Wesson. What's happening there when you shoot a 40 and a 10 is you got the extractor holding the shell so it doesn't go deep. See? It holds it out. And then you have an 1/8 of an inch jump so that the rifling isn't engaged. So that space right there, good or bad, accuracy could have, some issues. Here, the extractor could have some issues, maybe not. So the solution was just having a barrel like this, where you could shoot 40 Smith & Wesson, and not just 40 Smith & Wesson, but 40 Smith & Wesson hard cast, because 10 millimeter and 40 for hard cast isn't recommended in a standard Glock polygonal barrel. So you want to go to something like this, conventional rifle barrel. But anyway, thanks a lot for watching, you guys.